Okay, so a Criterion C lab report. The Criterion C1 portion is pretty straightforward. Criterion C1 is the presenting of recorded data and also the presenting of process data in tables and graphs. So that's something that we've practiced before and that you'll be in this lab allowed to work on with your partner. So this is the sample data set that was used for the practice data processing that we did. So your data table won't look exactly the same as this, but this is a pretty good option. It's very well organized. It concisely fits onto one page. The labels are clear. The units are included. Notice that all the values have consistent precision when they're used with the same kind of instrument. So in this case, all the mass values are listed to one decimal place. Oh, no, there's a mistake. Okay, so this should say 198.0. So that's a little detail to watch for that really shows that you're paying attention to the details. Again, when we're looking at temperature, we can see that all the temperatures are recorded to the same decimal place. So there's a label, there's a unit, there's a title that explains what the data is, things like trial numbers, not trail. A lot of people have a autocorrect or something where they always write trail. It's not a trail, it's a trial, so please try to spell it correctly. And the fuel names are listed on the left-hand side. Don't forget to include observations in a Criterion C1. It's an important component to have paid attention during the lab to what you observed, what you saw, smelled, heard, things like that, and try to be specific. You may have different observations for different treatments in your investigation. In this case, the different fuels may burn and look different when they burn and leave the calorimeter looking different afterwards. You should be doing sample calculations. So after you have all this data, I know that we went through using spreadsheets to make your life easier and to do a lot of these calculations, but you still need to show evidence that you know how to do each of the calculations by hand as needed. So before a process data table, there would be a section in your lab report where you show sample calculations. One sample calculation per type of calculation. So one calculation with Q equals MC delta T, one calculation of specific energy, one calculation of average specific energy, one calculation of half range uncertainty. I'm not so bothered by you showing simple calculations like subtraction. So doing mass initial and mass final and subtracting those two, it's not really necessary to show that sample calculation, I don't think, because it's such a simple calculation. So long as it's sort of referenced or clearly labeled in your data table, you can usually skip those. You're also welcome to include mass change or temperature change calculations in your sample calculations if you feel like it adds to the clarity. Once you've shown one sample calculation for each kind of calculation, you should have a process data table. So this summarizes all of the processed values. So it would show all of the Q values, the energy values that you calculated. It would show all the specific energy values that you calculated. It would show the average specific energies for each fuel, and it would show the half range uncertainties for each fuel. One I left out, percent error. We've provided literature values for each of the specific energies for each of the fuels, and therefore you should show how to calculate a percent error, and you should present those in your final process data table, one value for each fuel. And then the graph, in this example, we would be looking for a scatter graph. There should be a trend line that goes through your average specific energy values. So your independent variable on the bottom and your dependent variable represented on the left. Everything should be clearly labeled with units. You'll end up with some data points. You need to have a trend line going through the data points, and you should show the equation on the right-hand side, and you should show the R squared value on the right-hand side. We practiced that previously, and there's videos explaining how to do that if you don't remember. Another thing that I think is really nice to add is you can add an extra set of data with the literature values, and you can add a trend line to that as well, an R squared if you want. It's a nice way to visually represent the accuracy or inaccuracy of your data by seeing what your data points look like compared to the literature value data points. It's a good visual. The other thing that this graph needs to have is error bars. The error bars should accurately represent the half-range uncertainty values. So if your half-range uncertainty values are different, then the error bars should be different size. Again, we did this in a practice processing lesson, and there are videos explaining how to do this. So that is the expectation for the graph and for Criterion C1. Criterion C2, C3, and C4 have to do with conclusion and evaluation. So in Criterion C2, you have to interpret the data. So that means describing the trends in the graph. You can be stating the meaning with units of the trendline equation, particularly usually the slope of the trendline equation is a good thing to reference. You can talk about the R-squared value, which is a measure of how good a fit the trendline is for your data. You should comment on the accuracy of your data compared to the literature values and with reference to percent error. You can comment on the precision and or the reliability of your values based on the uncertainties and the error bars. And you should try to coordinate all of that together, pull it all together into a final statement about the answer to the research question. And in that answer to the research question, you can comment on how confident you are in that answer based on things like the error bars and the inaccuracy of your data. After you have answered the research question based on your data and kind of talked about how confident you are, you should then look at the method that you designed with your partner or partners, and you should try to identify strengths and weaknesses, discuss the impact of those strengths and weaknesses, and suggest realistic improvements. Now, strengths are fine, but it is an expectation that you try to identify, things that you think you did a nice job with, probably things that you did a nice job controlling. So think about your various control variables and whether or not you genuinely did a nice job controlling them, because obviously that's going to lead to increased reliability for your results. However, there are plenty of errors and weaknesses in this lab or limitations in the design of your lab. And so this is where you identify them here. So try to make it clear what you are referring to, what part of the method is a weakness, and talk about, why it's a weakness. Is this based on how your data is inaccurate? So the direction in which your data is off from the literature values? Is it based on an observation? Try to explain it theoretically. What do you think is happening, and how is it affecting your data? How is it affecting the data? So if you had a lot of inaccuracy, you should be trying to explain why you have that inaccuracy. If you have a lot of big error bars, big uncertainty, a big range of values, you should try to suggest what happened in your method that allowed for such variation in your data. So you're trying to explain things like the inaccuracy in your data and also the variation or the large uncertainty in your data. And you're trying to do that by picking out specific things from the method and really explaining step by step how you think it led to a particular inaccuracy or a lot of variation. Once you've identified and explained the weaknesses, you're trying to suggest changes in the method that would just make it better. You don't have to perfect it, but you should suggest something that would be realistic for someone to carry out in our classroom and explain how it would make the results better or why it would make the results better. Try to include specific types of equipment that you might change, specific changes to method steps, specific changes to amounts, and actually mention the new values or the new names that you would use to make your improvements realistic and really strong, nice and detailed. And if you can complete all those parts, then that is a Criterion C lab report.